Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. So right off the rip, like Bill's about to tell you, he's going to be talking about what to actually plant in your garden.
Hello and welcome back to In a Nutshell. This is Bill Brush, and today I want to be talking about what we would plant in a garden. And you have some options when I say what you would plant. Not only do you have the vegetables or melons or whatever you're going to plant, you also have some choices. And a lot of times I want to give you some help on how to make those choices. So first, there's really two ways to have to buy these plants. One is in the seeded form. In other words, they've grown the seed and they've got them all cleaned up and in a packet for you ready to plant. Or you're going to go to your local hardware, lawn and garden spot, and you're going to buy transplants, which is they've already grown up and they've emerged, and you can just take them back and transplant them right into your rows or hills, whatever you're using on your garden, and we'll talk a little bit about that later.
This next section is going to be about planting your garden from seeds.
So what's the advantage of seeds? Normally with seeds, you go there and you have almost an infinite number of different plants that you can get seeds for and plant. And it gives you multiple varieties of those within that. You might have 2 or 3 different types of broccoli, or you might have 2 or 3 squashes. And in addition to the different squashes, you might have a different variety of squash, and so gives you a lot of variety.
Now he's going to talk a little bit about transplants.
On the transplant side, you pretty much have what they have in front of you. You may want a specific tomato plant. Some people want beefsteak tomatoes. Others want early girls. And there just are infinite number almost of different varieties of tomatoes. But when you're going to use transplants, essentially, those transplants are what they have right in front of you. You can ask, they might be getting in shipments of other transplants here before long, but these transplants have been started for you and they're growing and they have got a root system and they've got foliage on top, and they will get you going faster. But again, you have some limitations. You only have the varieties that they currently have, and you got to make sure they're good quality. They haven't been sitting around getting old in their little medium that they're growing them in, that little cup usually. They're on flats primarily, and so you can get them that way. The other thing too is that with seeds, you have them available in packets, and so those packets are available 12 months out of the year. So in some places, transplants tend to grow seasonally. So they'll grow tomatoes at certain time of the year. They'll grow squash, they'll grow lettuce, they'll grow broccoli, cauliflower, all in different seasonal characteristics of your climate where they're selling them at. But you have to remember, too, on transplants, that maybe I'm in a very, very dry climate. Because there's a lot of vegetables grown in Arizona, for instance, during the wintertime, because they have a climate that's very conducive. Not as conducive when it gets to their summer, so they're really growing them in the fall, winter, down in those climates, and it gives them an opportunity to grow big quantities of those vegetables in a different part of the country before they come back to the normal cooler climates of the coastal valleys.
Now Bill's going to talk about the advantages of growing a garden plot with seeds rather than a transplant.
So what's the advantage then of growing a seed besides having variety? Well, you can plant just a few. And another thing is that what you plant is really important. Like, you may only put in 2 or 3 tomato plants because they'll be very fruitful and you'll have a lot of them. Well, a transplant's much better alternative than trying to plant a seed and grow a tomato plant up. And it takes a long time to do that. So you're going to be behind production on when that stuff's going to come to be fruitful and be ready to harvest. As opposed to seeds, if you're going to plant something in a row that's going to grow many plants, a good example would be something like a a lettuce plant that you could plant. Now, you could use transplants and plant them down the row, or you can just put seeds and get them germinated and up and then thin them out a little bit so you give them a little more room to grow. But those seeds are going to have to be planted very carefully. You know, it's very easy to look at a transplant and you just plant it to the level that it was planted at when you go to plant it. So what I mean is where the level is in your transplant medium, the little cup or little pot that it's been grown in, you're going to take that all out and you're going to put into a hole that you've put in the ground, put it down in there, pat it around, and you're still at the top of that medium, so that's the level it was at. Okay, so it's going to grow just fine from that area. If you, however, use seeds, they have to be planted at a depth.
Now diving deeper into the topic of seeds, Bill's going to talk about why it's so important to properly plant your seeds at the right depth.
And most people have a tendency in the past, when they first get started, to put them too deep. And the reason being is that you think that, well, you know, how could they possibly be, you know, a quarter inch below the surface? That would be not deep enough. But I will tell you, small seeds, and I'll take out the one that I always like to refer to, you know, radishes. Radish is a very tiny, tiny seed. Think of something about a third to maybe even a fourth of the rice kernel. That's how big the seed is. Very, very tiny. But it has a lot of energy, and it will grow you a radish in somewhere in the neighborhood from the time you see it emerge. You're probably going to get it out in somewhere in 2 to 3 weeks, 15 to 21 days. You know, and commercially, when we've done it, we've seeded crops, and we're sometimes harvesting them in 19 to 20 days. So if you put it too deep, this is your problem. If you put it too deep, that seed is not exposed to sunlight or carbon dioxide, which it's going to need both for photosynthesis. So it has energy in the seed to be able to emerge, put in roots around it, and push. It's called a plumule, but basically a shoot that will drive up through the soil and then expose itself to sunlight and the atmosphere, and then it can begin to photosynthesize and restore the roots. If you plant it too deep and you do not have enough energy to emerge through the top of that soil, then it'll just die right underneath the ground, and you'll never see the plant. So it's very important that you plant it very, very shallow. Now then, if it's exposed, the seed needs to be covered, so it can't be so shallow that when you give it some water, the seed's now exposed, because that won't work either. You want that kind of partly between having it deep enough but not too deep. And so most of them will give you a guideline when you get if you're planting direct seeded crops, it will give you a guideline on your seed packet. Plant a quarter to a half an inch or something like that. Maybe some will be up to an inch depending how big the seed is. You know, the bigger the seed, the more energy it's stored in there. You can look at a kernel of corn versus that little tiny radish seed versus a pretty good sized bean. Those are all three different sized, and the bigger they are, the deeper you can get away with planting them. But when you plant, you know, something, go by their guidelines. And what I recommend you get you a little ruler and utilize that, because you think, well, this isn't very deep. This is probably only, you know, quarter inch, and you all of a sudden find out that's a half an inch because you're just doing guesswork. So get you a little small ruler. It could be a metal one's the one I would kind of get, a little small metal ruler, because it won't, you know, damage over time. It'll stay good for you. And you can then measure the depth you want, then make you a nice furrow down a bed, you know, and we'll talk about making beds and how you do that a little bit later. But we'll have a bed right there that we'll put them down a row, okay? And in that row, you will put them a little fairways apart, literally like you have marbles between your fingers, and you just put them out of your hand and just spread them down the row. Don't worry if they're a little bit too thick, because as they come up, if they're too close together, you can remove, you know, one to get your proper spacing. Again, they'll give you spacing normally, but if you looked at, and I'll go back to a radish because it's something that's easy to visualize. That round sphere, obviously, I need to have enough space between it and the next one to be able to grow to the size radish I want it to be, which is probably somewhere around an inch to an inch and a half around in circumference there, or diameter, I should say. And then at that point, you need to have the next one come so that they aren't squeezed and don't make misshapen radishes, and you'll have that nice red round radish. So you can always, like I say, thin them out. Now, if you're going to do something, again, if you can't get enough energy to come out, then you're going to have a difficult time, and you'll have skips, you'll have spaces where things didn't germinate, or if they did germinate, they didn't have enough energy to get to the surface.
Now Bill's going to talk about why it's important to have enough moisture in your soil when you're planting seeds.
The other thing when you plant those seeds, these direct seeded vegetables, one thing you need to remember is when you plant them, put them in the soil, you want your soil pretty well at the moisture you want it to germinate. And what you would do is, and how do I know how much that is? Well, whatever soil type you have, if you have grab a handful of it, squeeze it and make a ball out of it, and then release your hand. And if that ball stays together, you have enough moisture there to germinate it. If it falls back apart, it's too dry and it needs to be wet or irrigated before you plant your seed. Now then, by the same token, if you make a ball and you turn loose and you see it shimmering with shiny water droplets, you have too much and you can overwater. So you want that happy medium between the two. And you've watered it before, and the best way to do it is once I have my seeds down that row and covered, a light, and I mean light, just to kind of seal the top so that it's got moisture that'll soften it to let it go through the soil when that plumule or that shoot wants to push through. And it sounds like a lot of work, but plants are very resilient, and a lot of them will make up for any shortcomings. But if you take a radish seed, for instance, and you push it down there 1.5 inches or 2 inches, it will probably not make it to the surface.
Now Bill's going to talk about how the soil type can actually affect the growth of your seeded plants.
Soil type makes a lot of difference. If you have a high clay content, you probably need to get it a little closer because it'll be tightened up a little bit. It'll have a more difficult time moving through there because there's not as much airspace like there is in a sand. But sands are their downfall is they can get too dry. So you always have an advantage to one and a disadvantage for the other.
Now we're going to switch back over to talking about transplants.
Now on the transplant side, the easy part is I know exactly how far I want these plants apart, and I can plant them down the row so many inches apart, and I can make sure I'm going to have them ready to go, and then I'm going to water them in. And normally when you put in transplants, and this is done a lot through commercial farming, they will put in what they call a transplant water. Well, in other words, you'll put in your transplants, you'll lightly tamp it down, and then you'll water over the top, making it just a light little small basin at the top so it'll hold a little bit of water. Not too much, but a little bit so that it'll go down into the ground, and then leave it alone and you'll see it start to take off, and then you're going to get on your regular irrigation schedule after that once you see it start to dry.
Now Bill's going to get into talking a little bit about water.
One of the things that I will always warn people about, a plant that has too much water looks exactly like a plant that doesn't have enough. You'll get wilting, you'll get the leaves will basically, or the foliage will begin to boat over. In other words, the outside components will shield because they can't take in any water, and that can be from too dry, but it can also be from too wet. Too wet because it can't take any water because the moisture in the roots is the same as the moisture around it, so there's no difference, so it won't move into the plant, and so that plant shuts down, and you'll have a lot of failures if you're overwatering. Particularly when you first start with a baby little plant, you can't water it, yet I see a lot of people do. The other thing too, in a transplant, it's been locked up in that medium, in that little small cubicle for quite a while. And what we want it to do is we want it to stretch its legs a little bit and get those roots out and emerge from that. And once it emerges from that, it basically can get into the soil and nutrients around it and then you'll really be able to get it to take off and start growing. So one of the things that we really like a good transplant water to contain is phosphorus. Small amount of nitrogen. We like that because and almost any phosphate comes with a little nitrogen with it. And that phosphate will stimulate root production. So phosphate's a little different than a lot of the other nutrients. That root has to grow into that phosphate. So if we put it right with the transplant water, we're really bathing the roots in phosphate. So as that root tip or starts to grow, it's immediately in phosphate. And when it does, it root flushes right around that phosphate to get some because it's a root stimulant. And you need a lot of phosphate early on young plants to get them to respirate, and what that is basically taking calories and understanding what they need to have calories for to grow. And also it's needed for photosynthesis. So it's a great starter to put in there. I like just a little bit of potassium because you're going to start to grow a little bit of strength to the stalk of whatever you're growing in that. And so you're going to give it a little stalk strength there. And it's nice to use a product that's got a lot of the different micronutrients in it. And in those quantities, it doesn't take much to get you off to a really good start. You'll always do better with anything you grow if you can get off to a good start. Difficult to make up for a real poor start, and you're going to be probably trying to chase a production level or the type of vegetables you want to grow if they got off to a bad start.
Now Bill's going to tell you what to expect when planting your garden.
So what should you expect? If you take and plant direct seeded, you should see emergence in 3 to 7 days. If you haven't, it's good maybe to go in and go around and dig down with your finger and find one of those seeds and see if it's too deep, or it's almost ready to pop through. A good time to look at that is in the morning and get the sun looking, with the sun shining down on it, look down that row, and you can begin to see the little plum mules begin to emerge from your seeds. That's what you should expect. Now, on a transplant, remember that transplant's been bound up in there for quite some time. And with that being bound up in there, it's kind of we call it a transplant shock, when you basically are planting it into a whole new environment and then trying to get it to take off and grow again. Again, that's a great reason why we'll put in transplant water when we use that to water in those transplanted.
Now Bill's going to talk about why it's so important to know how big your plants are going to be, as well as how many plants you plan on planting in your garden.
The other thing you need to know when you're planting direct seeded, or even on transplant, how many plants do I want and how big is that plant going to get? So have an idea how big a plant's going to be before you start to put it down the row. Direct seeded is not a real big issue because you can go in there and with a little tiny implement just pull them out to the distance you want apart. Here's one growing here, one growing here, 2 inches apart, and I'm going to take the one that's between them and just take it out and just go down your row and take out plants so that they're not too crowded. Transplants, you're doing it as you plant them. You're putting them 4 inches apart, 6 inches apart, whatever it is, as big as it's going to be. If you get a big ball of cabbage or cauliflower, obviously you don't want them, 2 inches apart, because they'll just be all over themselves and they'll be squashed and they'll be misshapen and they won't grow near as well as you give them the proper spacing. And that's, most of these things will be guidelines. You'll have the guidelines of how far apart to put them, but it's nice to know that, these cabbage, it's going to be a ball that's going to be around 5 or 6 inches at least. And you're going to want one then every 5 or 6 inches, and that's going to give it an opportunity to grow the size you want to. Remember, if you're going to work with this planting, you'll also have to remember that what distance is this thing going to grow? One squash will create a pretty good sized plant. One tomato vine will, particularly if you put a nice cage around them to support their upwards growth, it's going to take up a lot of room. And so those, I always recommend tomatoes because there's such a variety, because so many people grow them, that you can get a good variety of things that you want to grow. And then once you find one you like, maybe you want cherry tomatoes, maybe you want beefsteak, or you want a combination of all of them. And then you have to say, what are the vegetables that I want? I want to be able to have fresh lettuce that I can go into my garden and pick and take it into the house, and maybe that lettuce leaves will last for several days. If you're someone that likes the new found healthiness of a kale, learn that once I get my kale plant up, I can strip the leaves of that kale off, as long as I don't get the terminal one or several of the ones right on top in the terminal, and I'll regrow on that kale rather than just harvest it one time. So there's many, many things. We'll go through each and a lot of these different plants at different things, but I'm just letting you know when you're planting, you have a lot of options and you need to think a lot of things through. And last is you may even want to plant some type of flowering plant, like a flower. Marigolds have always been, people have put them in gardens for years. One, it gives you a lot of color, makes it look nicer, it's prettier, but it also attracts bees. And those bees may be needed. So if you happen to have, you'll get better pollination on your tomato plants. You'll get better pollination if you've got melons for sure. If you've got cantaloupes or cranshaws, honeydews, watermelons, they all will do better if you've got something to attract bees. And flowers, we'll get them to your flower, we'll get them quicker, and they'll get used to pollinating there and finding things that they can eat while your crops are getting ready to flower and bloom. And then once they're used to coming to your spot, bees are kind of, they follow a habit and a pattern, and they come back. Once they find that there's food in that location, they will bring more bees to that location, and that's what's going to get your crops pollinated. So hopefully that'll give you an idea when it comes time to plant. There are a lot of variations, and we'll continue as we talk about setting up your garden plot and how you would do it and what you should be looking for. And a lot of it, the good thing is you have an open canvas to do really whatever you want to do. And if you want to know the difference between what kind of results I got from a transplant and what kind I got from seeds, different types of crops and how well they did, that's what you can play around with. We'll put, we may put 2 rows of direct seeded, and then we'll put 1 row of transplants, and we may find the direct seeded were just as easy and they're more flexible in what we can do. So for now, keep listening, and you'll learn hopefully a lot about what you want to do as your garden season approaches. Thanks again.
Thanks, Bill, for another fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell. I'm sure that all of our listeners absolutely love to hear what you had to say about gardening and the differences between seeded and transplanted crops. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.